Hello, welcome to History of Russia, the Soviet Union, and beyond. Today we're going to cover two theories that explain the formation of the Kievan Rus. We will do that by discussing the Kievan Rus formation debate. We're going to talk about the Primary Chronicle, and then we'll discuss the Norman theory, the anti-Norman theory, and then a mix of the two. And then we'll close out with our conclusions. So, there's a debate that's been raging between Russian scholars for the last century or two. How did the Kievan Rus come into being? Some say it was the Slavs, and others are going to say that it was the Varangians from Scandinavia. There is a debate on when and where it originated. Some people want to say that external Scandinavian influences created it, and others want to say that it was the internal social processes and economic changes that caused it. So we'll discuss the Norman theory that attributes the founding to Scandinavian Vikings or Norsemen, and we'll talk about the other theory, which is, we'll just call the anti-Norman theory. Those arguers are going to say that the formations of the Kievan Rus are from the Slavs, who created it before the Scandinavian invasions. The Norman theory relies heavily on the Primary Chronicle accounts. But before I continue with the two different theories, I need to make a disclaimer about the Primary Chronicle. It's a non-contemporary source written by a monk named Nestor in the 1100s, and it's highly regarded as the best and worst reliable piece of Russian history. The reason it's great is because it tells the story of the Rus people that no other single source can do. And it tells a complete story, very comprehensive story. But it's terrible because there are, for certain factual inaccuracies within it, that we can prove are inaccuracies due to other outside resources. So, analyzing the Primary Chronicle with other sources can prove and disprove the Primary Chronicle, unfortunately, but also fortunately. So, when you study history, you have to consider this when looking at the source material. You know that winners are the ones who make the history, or rather, whoever wrote the stuff is the one who makes the history, but usually those writings happen to be from the winners. And with all that, people have their biases, and this means that the history that we see that is written from people long ago are going to have the biases towards those winners. So, for example, when we study the history through the writings of the Greeks, Herodotus comes to mind, and we learn a lot about the ancient Greeks and the Persian Empire from Herodotus. He wrote the history. It's literally called the history. But do you think Herodotus was a little biased towards the Greeks? I mean, or do you think he will use language that makes the Persians appear more powerful or superior to his fellow Greeks? Do you think he's going to try to make the Greeks look really awesome? Like the underdogs who won the Super Bowl against the Persians? Well, yeah, of course he is. It doesn't mean he's lying. I mean, maybe it does. But he's probably going to embellish a little here, a little there. For these same reasons, we need to proceed with our analysis of the Russian theories with a skeptical eye that both values what the Primary Chronicle provides us, but also scrutinizes the potential for embellishment and factual inaccuracies that it undoubtedly has, like we've proven it does have. Another critique of the Chronicle by Paul Bushkovitz from Yale University is depicted when he writes, quote, "The author was serving his rulers, identifying princes and people, and leaving historians with a muddle virtually impossible to sort out," end quote. So take that for how you want to interpret that. I hope this was an appropriate disclaimer, but without further ado, I present some of the writings of the Primary Russian Chronicle. So according to the Chronicle, in the year 852, the land of Rus was named Rus. In 859, the Varangian from beyond the sea imposed tribute on the Chuds, the Slavs, the Marians, the Vests, and the Krivichians. The Tsars, who you may remember as the latest rulers within the Dnieper basin from our last class, imposed their rule upon the Polyanians, the Severians, and the Vyetichians. But in 860 to 862, the tributaries of the Varangians drove them back to sea. So all those people that the Varangians conquered drove them back to sea. And after kicking out these Varangian outsiders, the former tributaries governed themselves, which makes sense. But according to the Primary Chronicle, without the Varangians bringing order and unity, the leftover tribes warred amongst themselves. Upon the bloodshed, the tribes asked themselves, "Why should we continue war? Let us seek a grand prince to rule over us and administer the law fairly." So the tribes sailed across the sea to the Varangian Ruses. The Ruses were one type of Varangian group, others being the Swedes, the Normans, the Goths, the Angles. The Chuds, the Slavs, the Krivichians said to the people of Rus, "Our whole land is great and rich. There is no order in it. Come rule and reign over us." They took 3 brothers from the Varangians with their kinsfolk, who brought all the Ruses and migrated with them. So the oldest, named Rurik, is going to locate himself in Novgorod. The second was Cineas, who located himself in Belozero. The third was Truvor, and he's going to locate himself in Izborsk. The land of Novgorod became known as the land of Rus. The present inhabitants of Novgorod are of the Varangian race, but prior to the Varangian race showing up, there were Slavs there. The 2 younger brothers died, and Rurik assumed sole authority over all their territories as well. Rurik sent vassals down the Dnieper towards Constantinople, and along the way, those vassals settled in an old Khazar town. They named it Kiev, and they filled it with fellow Varangians. So to unpack what the Primary Chronicle is claiming, it's saying that in the mid-9th century, the tribes of Rus, some of them were Slavic, were caught in between the Varangians of Scandinavia and the Khazar Empire along the Volga River. The Chronicle says the Ruses were Scandinavian Vikings who created the state for the tribes of northern Russia. It continues to say that the Rus was initially located in Novgorod and ruled by Rurik, the founder of the first Rus dynasty. It says that Rurik's vassals established Kiev. The Rus, it concludes, were ultimately descendants of the Varangians and native Slavs. So, we're going to now go on to the Norman theory, which uses the Primary Russian Chronicle to account for the formation of the Rus. I will explain how the Norman theory heavily uses that chronicle to evidence Kievan Rus formation. Most Normanists agree that the word Rus or Varig or Varangian are Scandinavian. They agree that the Rus and Swedes were identical. They agree that the latter found the Russian state in the Novgorod region. There are some more extreme Normanists who would say that the Varangians conquered and colonized East Slav lands, introducing feudal landholding and Christianity into Russia and creating the upper classes of Kievan Rus. There's even more extreme interpretations of Normanists who would say that the disorganized Eastern Slavs were civilized by the culturally superior Germanic Varangians. The reality of this theory, like the non-extreme portions of this theory, is that Swedish occupation of the northwestern Rus is undeniable. The archaeological record shows evidence that Swedish and Nordic settlements existed there. Norman proponents say that the anti-Normanists, which we'll talk about, they say that their theories are forced to create tall assumptions of Slav-Russian prehistory origins. It's an attempt to find any way possible to discredit the Norman theory. With the Primary Chronicle and the archaeological records, one is forced to conclude that the Slav people and the Nordic Rus peoples interbred, and that they fared well against the Khazar expansion from the southeast. and that they created a healthy commerce between them and the Slavs of the Dnieper Valley, ultimately leading to the formation of the Norman Russian estate. So let's think about this. If you are a proud Slav, like a proud Russian, let's say, do you see how this story can potentially piss you off? You're telling me that these Nordic invaders are ruling over me? Like, no way. This entire concept and hypothesis to the Kievan Rus formation is typically a non-Russian scholarly school of thought. And so now we're going to discuss the counter-hypothesis to the Kievan Rus. So Soviet historians don't refute all of the Norman theory, but they mostly agree on the following three ideas. One, the unreliable nature of the Primary Chronicle. Two, the first state of Rus arose from socioeconomic changes among Eastern Slavs before the Varangians arrived. And three, that the Rus were a South Russian tribe along the Ros River, which would later become the Rus region. So the anti-Normanists say that in the 6th to 9th centuries, it shows that Eastern Slavic states moving from primitive communal societies to feudal orders with private property of powerful feudal landowners. They say the idea that Eastern Slavs lagged behind the Western ones is a myth. They conclude that the archaeological record proves that the Kievan state existed before the Varangians arrived. The Varangians are explained as outposts that appeared in the mid-9th century. They say the Slavs and the Chuds drove away the Varangians. They say Varangians never controlled Rus towns, but rather created tiny outposts. They say that the number of Varangian peoples in Rus towns was meager. The cultural role of the Varangians is null, as they had nothing to do with the creation of the Kievan state, construction of cities, or establishment of trade routes. So, we have now heard both sides. Is it possible that a middle road exists? Is it possible that the truth to the creation of the Kievan state lies somewhere in the middle of these two theories? Early 20th century historian V.O. Kluchevsky believes so. I'm going to read an excerpt from one of his writings titled The Course of Russian History, which appeared a decade before the Bolshevik Revolution. He describes an interesting compromise. So, from the beginning of the 9th century and the end of Charlemagne's reign, armed bands of pirates from Scandinavia began to roam the coasts of Western Europe. About this time, along the river routes through our plains, began to appear sea rovers from the Baltic who were given the name Varangians. During the 10th and 11th centuries, these Varangians were coming constantly to Rus, either to trade or at the invitation of our princes, who selected from them their military retinues. But the Primary Chronicle records Varangian visits to Rus towns as early as the mid-9th century. A Kievan legend of the 11th century exaggerated their numbers, noting that these Varangians swarmed into Rus commercial towns in such numbers that they formed a thick layer of their population and submerged the local inhabitants. Thus, according to the Chronicle, Novgorodians, or people from Novgorod, were the first Slavs and later became Varangians. In the area of Kiev, they became especially numerous. According to the Chronicle, Kiev was even founded by the Varangians. Thus, the dim recollection of the Chronicle appears to move back the Varangians' arrival in Rus to the first half of the 9th century. These Baltic Varangians, as well as the Black Sea Rus, according to many signs, were Scandinavians and not Slavs. These Scandinavian Varangians entered the military commercial class that arose in the 9th century in the large trading towns of Rus. The Varangians came to us with different aims and appearance than the Danes brought to the west. The Dane was a pirate, a coastal brigand. The Varangian was primarily an armed merchant coming to Rus in order to make his way onward to the rich Byzantium, there to serve the emperor with profit, to trade, and sometimes to plunder the rich Greeks if the opportunity arose. The Varangians, settling in the larger commercial towns of Rus, met there a class of armed merchants, socially akin to them and needing them. They were gradually absorbed into it, entering into the commercial association with the natives or hiring themselves out for a good price to protect Rus trade routes. The hazy chronicle or account designates the first political units formed in Rus about the mid-9th century. The city-state, a commercial district administered by a fortified town that served as the commercial center for that region. When the Kievan Principality was formed, incorporating the tribes of Eastern Slavs, these formerly independent ancient city-states, Kiev, Chernigov, Smolensk, and others, were absorbed as administrative districts and ready-made subdivisions. The evolution of this earliest Rus political formation was accompanied elsewhere by the development of a secondary local form, the Varangian Principality. In commercial centers where the Varangian immigrants had arrived in especially large numbers, they readily abandoned their role in commercial associations or as hired guards over trade routes and became rulers. The transformation of Varangians from allies into rulers was, under favorable circumstances, achieved rather easily. Thus, some fortified towns and their environs under certain circumstances fell into the hands of the overseas immigrants and became possessions of the Varangian konugs. We find a few such Varangian principalities in Rus during the 9th and 10th centuries. The rise of these Varangian principalities explains fully the tale in the chronicle about the beginning of the Rus after the invitation of the princes from overseas. And end quote. So, conclusion. I think this debate is going to continue. As new evidence presents itself, I think historians will continue to push their biases in the direction that serves their purposes. Some of those purposes may be an honest search for the truth, but invariably, historians are people too, and people typically don't want to be wrong even when evidence may speak to the contrary. I think for subjects where experts debate, it becomes even more important for us to learn the facts for ourselves. You should always listen to both sides of every argument when a credible debate is to be had. Seek to educate yourself in such matters so that you yourself don't fall for someone's confirmation bias. So I ask you, how did your nation's history get written? Was it written by the winners, or was it written by outsiders who had zero skin in the game of your nation's honor and legacy? Comment down below and help start the discussion with me. If you liked the video, please comment, like, and subscribe. Please share this with your friends and watch over the previous chapters that I've made videos for. It's an amazing history that we all have this amazing privilege to study. Let's keep becoming better. Let's keep learning and keep pursuing knowledge for the betterment of ourselves and our communities. So again, stay safe and thank you.